Hey everyone, so this is Liam. This is the final video in the Brass Scorpion series. All we're going to do, nice quick one today, we're going to do the how to chip and scratch the armor panels. I've kept it relatively simple. There are more steps when it comes to doing this if you were doing something for a competition piece, but that will be held for a future video. So this is going to be a nice 3D chipping effect on armor panels. I hope it's helpful. As always, if it is, like and subscribe. If you want to share the video, that would be an incredible amount of help, especially as the channel's so young and I want to continue. If you want to support the channel, you can support me through Patreon, but more importantly, if you're interested in tuition, either in person or online, then check out the Patreon. All my pledge levels are based around tuition. And if you're interested in getting anything commissioned, like a centerpiece model or a display piece, feel free to get in touch with me through my Instagram and Facebook. So I'm going to show you how to do this on the claw. And I'm going to take some sponge. This sponge is from an old KR case, but you can also use blister sponge. The harder the sponge, generally the sharper the mark. But what I want is, I don't want that flat edge that you saw at the beginning. I want to get some rough sponge, so I don't want a point either, because that's going to leave a very definite mark and you're going to be able to see patterns incredibly easy with that. So I'm just tearing up the edges so I get lots of random shapes to it, and that way we're going to minimize patterns. And I say minimize because you're never going to get away from them completely, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean as well. So you see I've got a really random rough edge all over that piece of sponge, and then the intention is I'm going to squeeze the edge of the sponge together because that will give me a smaller area and there's less chance of me actually making a mess and hitting the trim or hitting the freehand. So I'm dabbing on some, this is Rhinox hide. If you hadn't noticed by my videos, I like Rhinox hide. It's a nice red brown. But so I'm going to show you on my hand. When you put this paint on the sponge, it's going to leave, you've got a lot of paint on the sponge, so it's going to leave a very hard blobby mark, and we don't want that. So, and also depending on how hard you press, as you can see on screen at the moment, you're going to get different marks. So the less paint you have, the smaller the marks you're going to leave. The more paint you have, the larger the marks that you're going to leave. So you want to find a middle ground. In this case, I want a fairly large mark because I want to start with some fairly large chips. So as you can see, I'm just tapping on. Now you'll have to forgive me because I do play around with the camera a little bit because I want you to be able to see it. But I'm tapping on the marks that I want with the sponge. Now, but you can already see I have a pattern. I've done it twice. I've even moved the sponge around, but both of those marks look very similar. They look similar because of the angle. They're both going towards the bottom left, and they're both roughly the same size. And this is the problem with sponging. So for an army piece, so you can see there, I moved that sponge, the position of it and everything, but even then that third mark that we put down, and even the other ones, are all very similar. They're all the same, similar shapes, and we don't want that. And this is the downside to sponging. Even sponging will give you patterns. If you're doing a display piece, I would strongly recommend you do not sponge and you do this with a brush, all right? Because you just don't want these patterns, because you can see, like, there's 4 of them there, and they're all going in the same direction. They're all set at roughly the same size, and people see it. Your mind sees and creates patterns. They will see this pattern. So what I'm doing next is I'm tearing up that sponge a little bit more. And the reason for that is this time, those marks that I did were quite large. This time I want them smaller. So when I dab it off on my pasty skin, you can see this time those marks are really, really small. I apologise, I will get this on camera in a second. But this time the intention is to go around where we have been working, and we're going to do much, much smaller marks. So you have a variation in the size of the chips, because if you have a large chunk out of something, generally you're not just going to have one large chunk. That can happen sometimes, but it's not the norm, it's not the rule. So you want smaller marks around it. So if you put a large chip or a large mark, you want smaller ones around it. The other thing that I will say, and this can be slightly controversial, don't do loads of scratches, all right? Scratches are nice to add some interest to it later on. But lots of scratches look awful. They always end up as pattern, similar shapes, similar directions. They're very unrealistic. Don't do it unless you really have to. They should be there to enhance what you've done. It's also worth noting with the sponging, I didn't thin that paint down at all. You don't want it watery because it will end up awful. So this is where we're going to add scratching, right? So this paint is thinned down a little bit just so it's fluid enough to actually put it down. Now, the other thing is with the scale that we paint, things can look very unnatural quite quickly. Now with this, bearing in mind that we've gone for everything about this model is worn, all right? We've done a lot of stippling, a lot of sponging, a lot of dry brushing. If we put a really sharp hard mark, it's going to look very weird. So even when I'm painting a scratch here, you can see I haven't done a long sweeping brush stroke. I've done that scratch with a series of small dots, and you're going to see it on screen here. I'm tapping that model with the end of my brush. I'm doing it with dots, and the reason for this is because it gives it an inconsistent finish. That scratch is not going to be the same size all the way along, and that's what we want. We don't want a nice uniform scratch because it will look out of place, it will look odd. So if you just do it with dots, and even then, and the good thing with dots as well is when you're doing it, it doesn't matter if those dots don't match up, because if you have a broken line, and you're going to see that here actually, assuming that I can keep it in focus, that line doesn't actually meet. There's a gap in the middle, and that just makes it, it's those little details that will make the difference. All right, so just think about it. The other thing is no patterns, right? When you're doing something, be very aware of you will naturally make patterns. You don't want the lines the same size, you don't want the chips the same size, you don't want the scratches the same size, you do not want them all going in the same direction. As soon as you see something that looks similar to something else, change it, right? Because it looks horrible. Because the thing is, the worst bit is especially if you're an inexperienced painter, if you look at something, your mind is going to know there's something wrong with it, but you're not even going to be able to tell what it is. So you're going to look at something and go, well, that's painted amazing, but why does it look weird? Why does it not make sense? Most of the time it's down to your brain making patterns, and everyone does it, and it's just something you really, really need to work on. Right, so next up we need to bring these marks to life. So we need to make them three-dimensional. Now, I appreciate this is probably quite artistic in its interpretation, because the reality is when you look at something from far away, or if it was this small, you probably wouldn't really see much of the highlights around some chipped paint. But remember, it's artistic interpretation. What you're painting is never going to be truly realistic because of the size. So what we're going to do in this case, I couldn't remember what color I painted the armor, so I just grabbed the scale 75 deep red. That might be it, it might not. And I added some skin tone to it, some Vallejo model color basic skin tone. So it made it a bit of a peachy color, like a salmon color. And then what I'm doing is I've thinned it down to probably 2 parts water, 1 part paint. So it's thin enough so it's not going to leave a physical mark, but it's opaque enough so I don't have to do lots of marks. I only want to have to touch this model with this brush once whenever I put my brush down. So but again, we're doing a dotting motion and we're painting underneath at the bottom of these chips. So you're just going to make sure you've got your armor panel or your model or whatever it is you're painting in the right position so you know where that light is coming from, and then the opposite of that light. So if your light is coming directly from the top, the bottom of that chip is going to be your highlight, and you're just going to paint it with dots, as you can see. And this is why how you use your brush strokes are so important. And I do talk about your brush strokes on my Patreon. So I don't really have any video content locked behind a paywall. So with Patreon as an example, my Patreon is set up purely for tuition. But as part of the tuition, you do get access to a series of videos around the fundamentals of painting. So brush strokes, paint consistency, positioning your model, bracing your hands, understanding color theory, all that sort of stuff. There's a series of videos which are being worked on to go, which are part of Patreon only, but the reason why they're behind a paywall as such is they come as part of the tuition service. So they're there to support your tuition that you have with me ongoing. But it's definitely something to think about while you're painting, what you're doing with your brush and why you're doing it. You need to be actively painting. You need to be consciously painting. If you just paint and you're doing the same thing that you do over and over, you're not learning anything. When people say to me, oh, you just to get better, you just need to practice, I don't entirely agree with that, because blindly practicing and painting is not gonna improve you very quickly or very efficiently. If you want to improve, you need to actively paint. You need to be consciously thinking about what you're doing when you're painting, because by doing that, you're going to push yourself and you're going to learn far more. And if you're the sort of painter that very rarely makes mistakes, and that's how I was once upon a time, a couple of years ago, you will learn very little, because if you're not making mistakes, you're not pushing yourself. It's as simple as that. When you're painting, you should be making mistakes, because you should be trying new things. You should be pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, especially if you're looking at competition painting. And that's what this channel is going to have, a lot of my own competition pieces, especially Golden Demon. The channel is going to be focusing a lot on Golden Demon competition pieces, while my streaming is going to be set up for probably a lot of non-GW stuff. But if you're thinking about winning a Golden Demon, and let me tell you, anyone can win a Golden Demon, right? It just comes down to whether you work hard enough for it. But if you want to win, if you want to be a competitive painter, if you just want to be a better painter, you need to consciously paint, and you need to actively try and push yourself. It's the biggest lesson you will learn. Right, enough of me rambling. So you've seen what I've been doing on camera. It's really a simple process once you know how. What I'm going to do now is I've painted underneath all of those chips and scratches, and that's made it more three-dimensional. In this case, I'm going slightly brighter. I've added a bit more of the basic skin tone to the pink salmon mix, and I'm just picking out little bits and I'm going to make them brighter. So just need to make sure that you've got a nice tip on your brush and you've got a nice point, and you test your brush stroke beforehand. And then what you're going to do is just pick out little bits that you think that might be interesting to be a little bit brighter. Now, you don't have to go this far with this. It's entirely up to you. The other thing to remember with this process is when you're painting underneath all the little tiny minuscule dots, what you need to remember is the layers of this. So the Rhinox hide, in this case, the darkest chip is where the paint has gone through. The chip has gone through the paint to whatever it is underneath that paint. The pink is the scratched off paint. So what you can do is just put little dots and little marks of the pink, the salmon, on the red paint anywhere. And what that does is it will just make it look like a really shallow paint chip. So it adds another layer of texture, adds another layer of interest to it. So then you have the Rhinox hide is the deepest chips, the pink is the lightest chips, very shallow chips, and then you have the red armor. But yeah, so you can see the result on screen. It's a very basic version of a really, really nice result, and I hope it's helpful. And that's it. That's the finished Brass Scorpion. That's the finished video series for it. I'm not doing the metals or anything like that because I'm not sure you're going to get a huge amount out of that. But I'm going to finish up the Lion and the Bat series, and then we're going to start a whole new playlist video series on what will be the start of my Golden Demon squad. So that'll be next. So I hope the Brass Scorpion series was helpful. I hope you like the result. I'd be really interested to see what you think in the comments. And as always, feedback is really appreciated because I do want to improve the channel and I want to improve on everything. So thanks very much.